Thank you for joining us to discuss employment issues during the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Nick Matash, and I'm a staff attorney with our MidPenn office in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Joining us also is Jim Orgass, who's a staff attorney in our Lancaster office. MidPenn Legal Services provides free legal assistance to low-income individuals who are facing civil issues.
We have 14 offices in 18 counties. We go as far west as State College in Clearfield, all the way down to the Maryland line, including Lancaster, Berks, Lebanon, York, and many others.
Slide. So the first topic is traditional unemployment compensation. And this is the unemployment compensation program that's been around forever. The unique thing about this program is that it really only applies to employees. And employees is kind of a term of art. It means workers who pay into the unemployment system. So if you're somebody who, when you get your check from your employer, that you'll see a deduction for unemployment compensation, that means that you're paying into the system. And then if you were to suffer a loss of your employment, you would be eligible to apply for these benefits.
I'm sorry, if there's one thing we'd like you to know about today's presentation, it's that you should get used to www.pa.uc.gov. That is going to be your friend if you have any questions about whether or not you're eligible for unemployment compensation. You want to remember that website. So please write that down, or do whatever you need to do to sort of look up for additional information.
The traditional unemployment compensation program really requires multiple elements in order for an employee to qualify for benefits at the end of the day. The first is you have to be financially eligible. And what that means is that, as we discussed before, you're paying into this insurance program, and based upon those wages and those deductions that are made to unemployment, that's going to not only determine whether or not you are eligible, but then also set what your weekly benefit amount may be. And assuming that the worker is financially eligible, then the next question becomes, well, is the reason why they lost their job going to allow them to be qualified for benefits? And we won't get into all of that, but just know that's what the unemployment representatives are going to be asking you about when you do apply for benefits. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. And then, Jim, do you want to talk about able and available?
Sure. So one of the key requirements, in addition to financial eligibility, is that you must be able and available for work. What does that mean? To a lot of folks that Nick and I have spoken to over the years, they think in their mind that it means they have to be able to go back and do the job that they've always done. But that's not what it means. It means you must be able and available for any type of work. So as an example, there may be someone out there who's done physical labor all their life. They get to a certain age, they're no longer able to do that type of physical work. But to be able and available means you could be a greeter at Walmart, you could have a desk job, you could do sedentary work. It just means that you must be actively engaged with the labor market.
And if the worker, the applicant, does ultimately qualify for these benefits, they're paid out every 2 weeks. There's a requirement that the claimant, as they're called, that they register with unemployment on a biweekly basis to let unemployment know that they are still unemployed but looking for work and unable to find suitable employment. And if they do have any wages that they did earn during the previous 2 weeks, they're to report that to unemployment. And so long as they still qualify, they will then be eligible for a 2-week benefit check. And under the traditional unemployment compensation, in the absence of all the COVID changes, that program generally caps out at 26 weeks of benefit, so half a year. And as we discussed before, the benefit amount is going to be based upon your qualifying wages from a 12-month period that they look at prior to your application. And that's kind of a cumbersome calculation they perform, so we're not going to go into all that. But unemployment will conduct that analysis for you. If for some reason you have wages which were not reported traditionally through like on a W-2 form or through another employer who didn't pay you traditionally, then you should have those records available to make sure that when unemployment is conducting that analysis, that they have all the information that they need.
And I would just add that traditional unemployment compensation is capped with a maximum benefit amount of about approximately $570, give or take a few dollars. So even though you may be earning much more than that, the maximum amount that you can earn in traditional unemployment compensation is approximately $570. Next slide, please. So what people are anxious to hear about, and I'm sure I'm speaking for Nick as well, many of our clients that we spoke to in the last few months, there's all these new programs out there. There's pandemic unemployment compensation, there's emergency unemployment compensation, there's extended benefits, and we want to cover all of those. What I found out in the last 3 months of talking to my clients during the COVID-19 crisis is that many people weren't even aware that they qualify for any of these programs. And they have been and can be an enormous source of income for folks. Maybe enormous is not the right word. An important source of income for folks who are temporarily out of work or had their hours reduced as a result of COVID-19. Nick, do you want to talk a little bit about the program?
Yeah, so the first one we're going to discuss is really, it's really exciting in that it's a total expansion and total diversion from the way we've always done unemployment compensation programs in the past. And it's called pandemic unemployment compensation. As we discussed before, the traditional unemployment program only covers employees, and those are typically folks who receive a W-2 and they're paid directly from their employer to perform a service. What this PUA seeks to cover is workers who have maybe they're independent contractors, maybe they do gig work, they're freelancers, and those folks typically would not qualify for traditional unemployment compensation benefits, and they would frankly just be out of luck under normal circumstances. And so the CARES Act recognized this as being an issue, that there would be folks who wouldn't be qualified for government programs to support them financially, and so they created this program. And there's some requirements to it, and like Jim mentioned previously, the Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry website, PEUC.gov, is a really good resource on this topic. It has frequently asked questions that discuss all the topics that are commonly brought up in these applications. But the bottom line is that it covers workers who don't qualify for unemployment, traditional unemployment, and that includes people who don't qualify for unemployment because of the reason why they lost their previous job maybe was disqualifying. But under this program, if they're unable to find work now because of the shutdowns or because of the pandemic issues, they may qualify for this special program.
And I could just point to 3 examples from the last week of clients that I've spoken with who weren't aware that they were eligible for unemployment compensation. Excuse me. One of them was a professional caddy at a golf course at the Lancaster County Country Club. So he works seasonally each year. He's self-employed. And so he wasn't aware that he could even apply for pandemic unemployment compensation. So I've referred him to do that. I don't know what the outcome would be. Another example would be, I was talking to a friend who has a son who's a student who worked part-time at his college, and obviously college is closing, was not able to work. He just recently received a check in the amount of $9,000 to compensate him for his lost wages for the period of time he was out of work during that period of time. A third example would be a client that I had that worked at a local dollar store who had his hours reduced as a result of COVID-19. He thought because he was still partially employed, he wouldn't be eligible for unemployment. I'm sure, Nick, you might have a couple other examples that might help people identify what type of work might be available to them. I'm sorry, what type of unemployment compensation would be available to them.
Yeah, so right now I'm working with a gentleman who worked in a restaurant that closed down due to the shutdowns, and he applied for PUA and was found to be eligible because the reason why he's not going back to work is because, and his employer actually is telling him to stay away from going back to work, is because he's an older gentleman and he has health concerns. And so he was able to collect on that basis. I also worked with somebody who was a house painter, who naturally people didn't want workers coming into their houses during this time. So he's unable, he normally works on a pay by the job type of scale. And so he wouldn't qualify for traditional unemployment, but he was able to collect this PUA benefit. So it's really a cool thing that's available to workers during this time. Now the benefit amounts they're similar but different, I guess I would say. Like the floor is 195 per week and the ceiling is 572 per week, and they base it upon your 2019 income. So that for folks who are either self-employed or freelancers, they may not have wages, they may have a different source of income. So this program is sensitive to that, and like the traditional unemployment, that the base of this program is available for up to 26 weeks. And it started back at the end of January, and it's going to continue on until the end of the year.
Next slide, please.
So this benefit has certainly gotten a lot of attention through the news. So I'm thinking most people probably have heard this, but the CARES Act also provides a bump, as we're calling it, to anyone who collects at least $1 of unemployment, whether it be traditional unemployment or that PUA program we were just talking about. As long as they collect at least $1 of that benefit, for any week that they collect that $1 at least, they're going to get an additional $600 automatically.
So you can imagine going from losing your job, having zero income, to getting unemployment plus an additional $600 per week. That's going to have an enormous benefit to you in terms of meeting your monthly financial obligations. The good news is you're receiving, if you qualify, you'll receive the $600 a week benefit. The bad news, and it's not really the bad news, is that this program is due to end at the end of July. So unless Congress acts, which we have no indication that it will at this point in time, but you would be eligible for the additional $600 through the end of next month.
And if you happen to be in another governmental aid program where you collect some benefit that's sensitive to your income, like you have to normally report to the provider what income you have, household income you receive, this benefit will count as income for those purposes. So be sure to report that. Now it's not gonna apply to Medicaid or CHIP benefits, but for most of your other programs, you have to be sure to actually report this to those providers.
The pandemic unemployment compensation extends the traditional UC benefit of 26 weeks for an additional 13 weeks. So you can receive unemployment compensation now in Pennsylvania for a total of 39 weeks of eligibility. Again, the bump doesn't include the 39 weeks. That expires at the end of July, but your regular unemployment compensation that you get every 2 weeks by filing your biweekly claim would be extended by an additional 13 weeks.
Slide. And we just touched upon this, but through the end of the year, the standard 26-week programs, whether it's traditional UC or whether it's the PUA, they're going to be expanded 13 weeks up to 39 weeks with other programs which may extend it even further.
We do expect that there'll be information forthcoming as the year goes on, but we have no idea what the information will be coming out of Congress. But there is talk now in both the House and the Senate that they want to do some sort of extension of funding for folks who are struggling to meet their mortgage payments and rental obligations. So pay attention to the news. There will be more information forthcoming. We just don't know what it's going to look like. Next slide, please.
And this is a recent development that this is a state benefit that the state is expanding. They're adding on an additional 13 weeks. So now you start off as 26 weeks, And then through the federal program, there was an additional 13 weeks. Now the state is going to add an additional 13 weeks. So there's potential for 52 weeks of benefits. The state extended benefits is going to, how they're going to calculate it is they're going to look at how many weeks you qualified for your standard program, and then you're eligible for up to 50% of those weeks. So if you do exhaust all 26 weeks of your standard program, then you'd be eligible for an additional 13 weeks on top of the 13 weeks that you get from the federal level, and then your normal 26 weeks.
And hopefully we're not talking to anyone out there that had to live through this in 2008, 2009, 2010, when we had our last recession affecting the national economy. But what we saw during that period of time is even benefits being extended beyond 1 year. I think at one point in time during that recession, benefits extended for an additional 2 years. I'm sorry, for an additional year, for a total of 2 years. So again, we have no indication that's going to happen in this case, but the fact that we've gone from 26 weeks to potentially 52 weeks is an enormous help to folks who are not able to work or unable to work because of the economy.
So the first question ought to be, who should be applying for these benefits programs? And we thought we'd give you a list of workers who may not think that they would naturally qualify. The first group is people who had their hours cut by their employer. I know a lot of employers are either telling folks to work certain days and then take other days off, and they may not be compensating them for those days off, or they may be restricting their hours in other ways. And if your hours are being reduced, that difference in income that would otherwise be available to you may be justification for qualifying for one of these programs. Naturally, if you were completely laid off, hopefully you already applied for one of these programs. Likewise, if your employee,
go ahead. Your employer told you to stay home because you traveled to another country with a high rate of infection or have a cough. So obviously, as we know, well, the good news is in Pennsylvania, the virus seems to have been leveled off somewhat, and infections are not increasing, but there's still exposure out there, as we all know. So if you traveled out of the country, you may be asked or told that you can't work for 2 weeks and you need to self-quarantine. If you have a fever or infection or a cough or exhibiting any of the symptoms of COVID-19, you should not go to work or report to work. You should let your employer know right away that you are having symptoms. And so in those situations, you may be eligible for pandemic unemployment compensation.
Likewise, if you're someone who has a pre-existing condition, which may make you more susceptible to complications from being infected with COVID-19, even though the business that you work for may still be open, if you have issues with returning to that employer, you should explore your options through these programs by applying for one of these benefit programs.
And now may be a good time, Nick, to encourage folks as we go through this list that these are complicated situations and they're very factually intensive based on your own circumstances. So if you qualify for free legal services through MidPenn Legal Services, you may want to contact our offices and have a consultation with an attorney or paralegal who's versed in these issues so they can help you decide what your best options are in terms of applying for unemployment or any other programs that may exist for you. But another example, maybe you cannot go back to work because you can't get childcare, or school is closed or may not be opening in the fall because of an increase or a second wave of the COVID-19. So in those situations, even though you haven't been fired from your job, you just cannot return to work. You may have good cause not to go back to work based on your own childcare situation.
And that may include also if you live in a county where there's, let's say, right now I think almost every county is in green in Pennsylvania, but we don't know where this is going. There may be in certain pockets a resurgence, and so we may transition back to a more restrictive stay-at-home orders, and that can be a factor in this as well. Similarly, if your employer fired you because you refused to work, in violation of current shutdown orders, that can be cause for someone to be found to be eligible for one of these programs. So like Jim mentioned earlier, if you're unsure, we typically tell folks to just call into our office and see if you can get some guidance. There's also, we're going to talk later about a statewide hotline, which is helping folks answer some of these questions that are floating around out there. And the website, the Pennsylvania Labor and Industry website, is a good resource as well.
So the one thing you want to do for sure is communicate with your employer. You at least have an obligation to let them know, aware of your own personal situation or concerns with regard to your employment. It's much more likely that in a situation where you may have to have what's called a referee hearing to determine your eligibility for unemployment, that it's going to be important for you to have at least one conversation with your employer with regard to your return to work or your personal situation. So before you make a decision not to go back or quit or stop communicating with your employer, please reach out to them, explain your situation, and see what the response is that you get from them.
If you are applying for benefits, please be mindful of these following issues. The first is that there's literally millions of Pennsylvanians applying for these benefits at this moment, and the system is overrun with applications. They're having trouble processing and keeping up with the application, so it's important that you make your best effort to be as accurate as possible when you're answering questions, and you provide full information when you are applying for benefits. You don't want your application to be one that gets set aside because it has certain issues, and then somebody else has to circle around and try to, either contact you to figure out what's going on, or they may ask you to, resubmit certain information. That's just going to slow down the process for you. And I'm sure bills are piling up, so it behooves you to try to answer the application as as not only truthfully but also as accurately as possible.
So there are important documents to have handy when you fill out your application for unemployment. You might need your tax return, your employer's name and address, your pay records, your contracts, invoices, billing statements. You want to gather all that information so it's available to you as you go through the application process. It's important to know the last day that you worked, possibly the first day that you worked, and the reason for your separation.
And in a similar tone, make sure that you're taking notes of any time you do have interactions with unemployment representatives. You want to make sure that you're taking a note on when the conversation took place, who you spoke with, and what topic was discussed. And that'll help down the road if there are any issues with what you may or may not have told unemployment in processing your application. And in a similar vein, if you are found to be eligible, you want to make sure that you stay on top of your bi-weekly filings. This is where you're registering with unemployment. I usually tell folks to keep a calendar that's devoted to that purpose, just to make sure that they're not missing any of those days that they need to register for benefits, and making sure that you're keeping track. If you do have any wages that come in, that you're reporting that to unemployment.
So as you can see, there is a free statewide hotline at 1-888-313-7284. We don't encourage you to use that just because, as Nick mentioned before, the system is incredibly stressed as we speak. Our unemployment rate went from around 5% up as high as 20% and maybe around 14 or 15% as we speak. That means it's tripled in a short period of time. So the state is trying to respond to this crisis the best that they can. It is very difficult to get through on that number. And if you do decide that's your best option and are not comfortable using technology or don't have access to a computer or a smartphone, that the only thing you can do is call the hotline number. It's likely that you're going to face serious delays and you may have to continuously redial that number to get through to someone. What I'm about to say is easy to say and hard to do, but the best advice we can give with regard to the hotline is to be patient and to be persistent. So understand that the system is stressed. everyone out there is working to the best of their ability as hard as they can, but it's just taking a while to process the backlog that exists in the system as we speak. There are two additional helpful websites by our sister organizations in Philadelphia. One is www.philalegal.org. The other is www.cls.org. Those are both legal services organizations in Philadelphia that have additional detailed information on their website about unemployment compensation, all the different programs we discussed, eligibility issues, reporting back to work issues. So if you want to look into this a little bit more, we encourage you to go to those websites as well as the state's website.
This next slide is a flow chart to help you decide how to answer what is a really important question when you're applying for any of these benefits, which is if you are what we call separated, that means you're no longer working for a prior employer. Being as accurate as possible and answering the question as to why you are separated is really important, and it helps to speed up the process if it's accurately reported. So I'm not going to go through this whole chart with you. You can pause if you want to stop and look at this, but this is a really helpful slide to help guide you through the process of deciding which reason for separation applies to your scenario.
And I would say Nick and I probably combined have about 50 years of legal experience in representing claimants in unemployment compensation hearings. And when he says this is an often overlooked category or question that is on the application, it's very true. There's been many referee hearings that I've attended where a person responded to this question in a way that the referee didn't agree with or was concerned about, that ultimately could have impacted their eligibility for unemployment. So spend some time with it, think about what it is. We don't want to go into all the reasons of eligibility, but basically there are two categories normally. You quit your job, and the burden of proof is on you to prove that you had good cause for doing so, or you were fired from your job, and the burden of proof is on the employer that you committed willful misconduct. Would you like to add anything else about those, Nick?
I don't think so. I think that's good.
Go ahead,
Jim.
Two last things we're gonna talk about. And before I get into this issue of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, I did want to mention that in the next week to 2 weeks, for any folks out there who are having trouble either paying their mortgage or paying their rent, the state of Pennsylvania received $175 million in federal CARES Act funds to assist homeowners and renters who are having difficulty paying their bills. The program is being administered by Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, and there'll be local partners located in each county. So there will be financial resources available to folks. Look for information in the next week or two about the particulars. Contact your local legal aid organization if you want to find out how you qualify. I believe the website, the applications may be available on the phfa.org website. So you may want to look at that as well. Nick, do you want to talk a little bit about the FFCRA?
Yeah, so the Family First Coronavirus Response Act was created to respond to the problem of workers who, although they're working, they can't go back to work. And so it kind of operates a little bit like FMLA. That's the niche that it's trying to fill, but most people who aren't going back to work right now, they wouldn't qualify for FMLA. And if you do qualify for FMLA, there's no requirement under FMLA that there be any compensation provided to the worker if they're not able to go into work. It just, FMLA merely holds their position with the employer. But this particular act applies to employers who have fewer than 500 employees. And the way that it breaks out is it provides up to 80 hours of fully paid sick leave if you are quarantined due to COVID-19, if your doctor tells you you have to self-quarantine due to some kind of an issue. So it can't be that you decide you have to self-quarantine. It has to be a doctor who tells you to self-quarantine. or if you have symptoms and are seeking a medical diagnosis. The benefit programs that are attached to this portion of the Act are not to exceed $511 per week. The second part of it is for workers that can get up to 80 hours of sick leave. Now, this is going to be at 2/3 pay if they're staying home because they have child care issues or daycare is closed, or if you're taking care of someone else whose doctor told them to self-quarantine. So this could be a spouse or a family member. And then for this part of it, the cap on compensation is not to exceed $200 per day. But I feel like a lot of folks don't know about this program, so I'm glad we were able to squeeze this one in there. Because if it does apply to you, you should certainly explore your options through that act.
So final comment is, if you think that you may be eligible for unemployment, then you should apply. There's no penalty for applying and being denied. If you know that you will not be financially eligible because you didn't work much in the last year, then you probably do not want to apply for traditional unemployment compensation, but you would want to apply for the pandemic unemployment compensation. So there are resources available out there for you. If you have any questions, please feel free to give us a call or contact one of the other local nonprofits in your area. And hopefully we don't see you in our offices, but if we do, we'd be happy to help you and look forward to meeting you sometime. Thank you very much for listening to us. Any final comments, Nick?
No, thank you.